Hi, my name's David.
And I'm John.
And we're the Debt-Free Guys, and this is Queer Money. We believe in dreams and that we all have dreams that can come true, and that's partly what this show is about. We also believe that there needs to be a voice that speaks for and with the LGBT community when it comes to personal finance, and that's why we're here.
This episode of Queer Money, we are asking the question, is it wise to come out at work? There's been a lot of progress in the LGBT community over the last couple of years, but all that progress isn't in tandem. So we want to just discuss the risks and rewards of coming out at work. Right. Today's show is brought to us by HIV Smart. HIV Smart is dispelling the myths surrounding HIV. So we thank them for their sponsorship, and we ask you to please visit their website at hivsmart.org.
And as I just mentioned, Queer Money is an open discussion, so we'd love to have you join in the discussion. If you'd like to add comments, please do so on the right-hand side. If you're going to ask a question, type /Q before the question, and then the question will appear for the rest of us to see. So let's go ahead and get started by meeting our guests.
Yes. So, Jay, would you mind giving us a little introduction about yourself, please?
Sure. My name is Jay Allen, and unfortunately, you can't see me, but you can hear me. But Jay Allen, and I currently am have my own consulting firm, Jay Allen Associates. Until June of last year, I was the Chief Administrative Officer for Charles Schwab, and prior to that, had been the Executive Vice President for Human Resources for a number of years at Schwab.
Awesome, thank you. We really appreciate having you. Thank you for coming on today. So,
I should probably also say I'm also gay. And have been out at work since 1981.
Wow, thanks. That's cool.
Thank you.
I can't wait to dive into that.
Yeah, definitely.
So, Dave, we'll give you the floor. Would you mind introducing yourself, please?
Sure. Hi, I'm Dave Montes. I'm the Executive Director at One Colorado. For those who don't know, One Colorado is the state's leading advocacy organization for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people and our families. We are a statewide organization.
You guys do a lot of great work, and we appreciate that. And we appreciate your time. We know you're very busy. You just came from the Capitol today, so.
Yeah, thank you so much to both of you, not only for having me, but for what a brilliant idea to do this. So thank you both.
Absolutely, thank you. So to get things started, Jay, you kind of alluded to it. Does anybody have, one of the four of us have a story they want to share about coming out at work?
Well, I'm not really gay.
I can tell by how mugshot you are.
Most of my career has been in the LGBT advocacy arena. So I think, fortunately, I've always been out and have sort of, I think, had probably a different experience than a lot of people who do come out at work and have to have sometimes difficult conversations, sometimes accepting conversations. But sort of given the work that I do and the work that I've done for most of my career, I fortunately have not had to come out, quote unquote.
Yeah. That's definitely a story. Go ahead,
For
Jay.
a lot of us, coming out at work maybe happens along a continuum. There's I had a friend way back many years ago. It'll tell you how old I am, but back when the Briggs Initiative was being debated in California, and he was a Spanish teacher, and he said, what do people think I do? I announced that I'm gay and said, okay, now let's learn Spanish. I think for me, I don't know that I ever came out at work. It's just, what I did instead was I fell in love, and it was my first real love. I'd fallen in love with him, and I thought what you did when you loved someone was you put a picture of them on your desk. And that's what I did.
Right.
And that was coming out at work because it was a picture of he and I, and it generated questions, and I was really happy to answer them because I was so happy and so excited. And maybe I was naive, or maybe I didn't care, or maybe I was so in love that I wasn't thinking straight. But that was what I did.
Mm-hmm.
Gotcha.
What happened was something quite different, but that's what I did.
Right.
Yeah, interesting. Well, that's similar to my story. I transitioned from being a very religious person to being out. Basically, I was raised in a very religious household, and I was living here in Colorado, and then I ran away to South Dakota to try to find myself. And when I came back from South Dakota, basically, I really to me, that was my time for me to come out. And I knew that at that time I was going to lose pretty much 99% of my family and friends because of coming out. And the way I came out at work was basically by starting a job. When I started working full time, it was kind of, I already knew that was a process or path that I was on in life. And it was about 2 months into work that a new employee caught my eye. And we started hanging out, and within a couple of weeks, everybody at work knew that we were gay because we were spending all of our time together. And it wasn't, like you said, it wasn't, and same with you, Dave, it wasn't necessarily that I announced to everyone, but it just seemed a logical transition for me because of the fact that I was spending so much time, or people knew that I was with this person a significant amount of time. And it just kind of happened. Which I guess I have to say I'm very fortunate that I worked for, this is back in 1996, so I worked for a company that it didn't matter, and lived in a state where it wasn't an issue either.
Yeah, that's similar to my story. I was at Charles Schwab. That was my first real job out of college, and I never thought anything about it. I just came out. I never made it an issue. I didn't go to work with a pride flag on my back, but I also didn't hide it, and so it kind of came out organically. And I never had any experience of discrimination or anything. Yeah. So I find that interesting. So we have 4 gay men on the panel, and nobody really had a problem coming out.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, although I will say that David, you said that you came out in 1996. Colorado didn't pass its non-discrimination law until 2007.
Right.
So you were lucky. Had someone at work, I know the company, because there may have been some internal policies, but if there weren't, had someone at the company had a problem with you, they could have fired you just for being gay.
Right.
And that's the reality. Only 22 states have non-discrimination protections for gay and lesbian people, and only 19 of those 22 include transgender Americans. And so that is the reality for a large part of the LGBT population in the United States.
Yeah, that's part. Sorry, go ahead, Jay.
I said I wouldn't say that I had a problem in coming out. It was relatively easy for me to make the decision to be who I was. That is not to say that there wasn't a consequence. Mm-hmm. And even though I was working for IBM at the time, a big company, which even in 1981 had a non-discrimination policy, the fact was it really wasn't okay. At that time. A lot has changed now, but there clearly was a consequence that I didn't realize at the time.
Yeah.
And I think my career there plateaued as a result. It wasn't that anyone ever said, "We're not giving you a job because you're gay." It's just simply that I was never in the consideration set that I thought I should be in.
Right. Gotcha. It's very interesting you say that, Jay, because I just read an article today that said based on a study that a woman has done, that in the UK, the average gay white man will spend about $54,000 in
US dollars
above normal of what a straight counterpart would spend to get the same career advancement. So the considerations may not be just whether it's discrimination, but it also could be financial. And that's part of the reason why we're having this discussion. And like you said, Dave, not every state it's easy for an individual or legal for an individual to have the same protections. So that's part of the reason why we wanted to have this discussion, make it a little bit more open as to why we want to continue to have these conversations. Many of us who live in large cities and in states where it's very easy and comfortable, we may forget about our counterparts who live in states or work for companies that do not have the same protections.
Yeah, I mean, I think you touched on something, David, that there are multiple forms of discrimination. It's not just hiring and firing. It's promotions, it's salary, it's there's a lot of different ways that discrimination within a workplace can play out. For example, in Colorado, we just did a study, and Colorado did a study a couple of years ago. There are transgender people in Colorado who have 4-year bachelor degrees and the same experience who are making half of what a non-transgender person with no bachelor's degree is making.
Wow.
When you look at the data, it really is just because they're transgender that they're facing that sort of discrimination. And while we have a state non-discrimination law that protects transgender people, but yet that is still happening in Colorado.
Right.
I would also add, I think it's important to add that, and I try to remember this, I've spent my career with large corporations, many of them Fortune 500 companies, most of them Fortune 500 companies. And there's a great divide in this country. I think that a lot of Fortune 500 companies have moved, not to say that some of the types of discrimination that Dave has talked about and I did, it's not just hiring and firing, doesn't occur at those companies, but they've made a lot more progress, faster than most states. But most people don't work for the Fortune 500.
Right.
Most people work for companies that have 5 or 10 people. And it's a very different proposition when you're in a small town and you're working for a small employer and you're in a state that doesn't give you protections, and that is your livelihood, and that's the way that you pay for your children's health care. It's a very different proposition.
Right. It's so true.
So considering all that, what can an LGBT member or queer member of the community do to protect themselves or to recognize that they're being discriminated against? If at the time, for example, Jay, you didn't know you were being discriminated against, how in hindsight would you recognize that?
Well, I guess the only way for me to answer that is to say what I did. It became very clear to me that jobs that my boss actually thought I was ready for and qualified for, I wasn't being considered for. There was always a good reason why. And I concluded that it was pretty obvious to me that it was because I was gay. I also knew some people who worked fairly high up in corporate who said as much to me. And my decision was, and I want to be clear that I'm lucky in this regard. My decision was, I'm not a victim. I'm not going to stay and work someplace where this is a problem. I will go and find a job somewhere where it's not.
Right.
I had that option.
Right. I'll completely agree with you there, Jay. It's interesting. It's what you're saying is very similar to these. I read 2 articles today that were very much about this in preparing for the show, and the one that mentioned the additional pay also talked about entrepreneurs and how entrepreneurs in the U.S. who are gay have migrated to the coasts primarily from the center of the country to the coast primarily because they feel that they can operate a business in a more progressive environment. And because of that, they've also created jobs in those areas. And it's just this feeling of comfortableness that has taken them to those parts of the country. And it kind of reminds me of the idea of cities of refuge, where I think those terms were kind of originally started when you think about the gay ghettos of New York or San Francisco or LA, where people felt like these were the areas that they could live in that were easy to protect them physically. And now then after that, they started moving on to the protections of being protected financially or legally by the state. So I think that's kind of, some people wonder why there is this vast chasm between some states and others. Well, maybe that's partly because people, that feeling of comfortableness and moving to where they feel like they can operate and live in a lifestyle or work in an environment that they're comfortable with.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'll say that being anti-LGBT is not profitable. There's a reason the Fortune 500 companies have sort of led the charge on diversity and respecting diversity, because they understand that multiple viewpoints equals profit. Right. And so, you only have to look to Indiana and what happened when Governor Pence signed their religious exemptions law. They lost $60 million in conference revenue. Salesforce pulled out, one of the new centers that they were building there. Georgia just recently is considering religious exemptions legislation there, and small and medium-sized companies have already said, we will leave the state if you pass laws like this. There are Hollywood has said, there's a huge film industry in Georgia. Hollywood has said, we will not send our actors to Georgia to film, television, and movies if you pass legislation like this. And so, I mean, I think that there is some altruism on the part of Fortune 500 companies for doing the right thing, but I don't think it started there. I mean, I think it started as a recognition that diversity and respecting multiple viewpoints equals profit.
Right.
Yeah, that study that you pointed out to me earlier today.
Right. Yeah. Goldman Sachs did a study, and they basically said that individuals who are comfortable at work, living, are satisfied and comfortable with who they are at work, they have shown an increase in productivity by 15%. So if you can get 15% more out of your employees, every employer is going to love that, no matter what. And I think that you speak to that. It doesn't matter who you are or your viewpoints if you're comfortable expressing them, or at least not hiding them. And Jay, I'm going to go back to something that you said back when we were at Schwab that kind of really stuck with me, was the effort that it takes to hide who you are by just simply using the opposite or other pronouns, and the inability to express your true self. You put time and effort into that. Your employer is paying you 100% to be there 100% of the time. And if you can't be out, then you're not there 100% of the time, which I think, like you said, Dave, a lot of Fortune 500 companies are taking the charge on this. We're hoping that trickles down into some more of the medium, small business companies as well.
Well, the good news is that I think that the public opinion and with time, the opinion is with us. I mean, the fact that you would discriminate against someone because they were gay, I think is not okay any longer. You can't get agreement that that's okay any longer, and that's a good thing. I mean, your question, is it financially wise to come out at work? I mean, I want to be respectful of people who live in circumstances that are very different from mine. But for me, how could it not be financially wise to come out of work? And it's really, for what you said, it's just any amount of effort you put into cutting a part of yourself off and hiding it from others means you're not at your best.
Right.
And I think it's just you need to be at your best. Why wouldn't any company want you to give your best to them?
Exactly.
No, go ahead, John.
I was just going to say, I guess there's this perception that maybe they can get rid of every gay, right? So if we can get rid of every gay, then everything will be perfect. But that's not going to happen.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I would caution though, the question was, how can someone prepare for coming out at work? I mean, I think you're right that while it does take a lot of energy to hide who you are, while diversity is profitable, while all of that exists, I mean, we're talking about people's livelihoods here, right? So, I mean, I think that there are some steps that you should take. Do you have a non-discrimination policy within your company? Does your state have a non-discrimination policy that protects LGBT people? Is there an LGBT employee resource group in your company, right, that is supported by the company? Are there openly gay members of leadership? Right there, these are all signs that it is a safe place to come out. And so I think that those are calculations that you need to make, or like Jay said, go find a different place to work where, I granted is easier said than done sometimes. Right. But if it is becoming a burden to you, or volunteer with an organization like One Colorado to change your state's non-discrimination law to include LGBT protections. But there was national statistics show that 42% of LGBT, lesbian, gay, and bisexual people have experienced mistreatment on the job, and 78% of transgender people have experienced mistreatment on the job. Those are big numbers. And so I think that while public opinion, yes, definitely is moving our direction, while we have had a lot of victories, particularly on legal protections in some places, there's still stigma that exists, particularly for transgender people in our communities.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting you say that, Jay, because I'm sorry, Dave. One of the things that caught me kind of very square in the eyes when I was reading one of the articles this morning was the basically the statement the individual who wrote the article was saying that things have changed a lot for us over the last 2 years. They've gotten better. And basically they were saying that because of that, we don't have to worry about it anymore. And just because DOMA passed and individuals in the military have the right to live the lives that they want, or that we now have a marriage equality, doesn't mean that there's been this mass shift in the vast majority of individuals. If 2 years ago you didn't agree with marriage equality, it's highly likely that today you still don't agree with marriage equality. And that person could be your employer, or that person could be somebody you're competing with at work to get a better job. And so you still have to take into consideration that there are individuals. We live in a country that allows us to believe and live the way we want. And we have to live with the fact that there are still going to be individuals who don't want us to live and believe the way we want.
I think that's right. I mean, the national organization GLAAD and Harris Interactive released a study, a poll just a few months ago. You know, you've got vast majorities of people saying that they still feel uncomfortable seeing two men holding hands. Vast majorities of people saying that they wouldn't let their children go over to a gay couple's house and play with their children. So, you know, the stigma is still exists. You know, I mean, I think on marriage equality, you know, we may have reached a tipping point. Recent polls in Colorado show us that nearing 70% support for the Supreme Court's ruling. So, I mean, I think it's issue by issue, but I think that there's still stigma that exists for the LGBT community, particularly for transgender people. I mean, 20 years ago, there were only 20% of the population knew someone who was openly gay or lesbian. Fast forward to today, and that number is 90%, though I'd love to meet that 10% who doesn't know someone who's gay or lesbian. But for transgender people, it's 20%. It's where we were 20 years ago. And so, you know, I think there's a lot of need for making sure that the stories of transgender people are told, the real stories, not this sort of anti-transgender stereotype that our opposition loves to feed the media.
Yeah.
So I'm hearing two things. I guess the first thing that I was hearing was that maybe before joining a company, you should be a little bit cautious about what their LGBT policies are and, you know, what their discrimination policies are. But on the other hand, I hear that it seems like the more exposure that people who might be biased against the LGBT community have with lesbians and gays and transgender people, the better things get. So unless you want to be a martyr at your company, you could be putting yourself at risk, right? Yeah. I mean, so I guess what's the takeaway? Is the takeaway really be cautious about the job that you take before you get in there, or try to fight the good fight and change opinions when you get there?
Personally, I think that Dave gave some really good advice about, you know, understand, is there a policy, understand what the situation is in your state, are there open leaders in the company? So prepare yourself for it. I also have a lot of room for people to figure out what they can tolerate at what points in time.
Right.
Having said all of that, I've long believed, and I was very involved in something called The Experience in the 1980s. And I think the person who said it best was Tammy Baldwin, who's a senator from Wisconsin. And she said this at the time she was a congresswoman. And she said, if you want to live in a world where it's okay to walk down the street holding your partner's hand, then walk down the street holding your partner's hand.
Yeah.
If you want to live in a world where it's okay to be open at work, you have to be open at work.
Right.
I do think, you know, I do think that when more people know that they know people who are gay and lesbian, okay, we're at 90%. When they know more people who are transgender and they know that they know them, that's when people have to confront the humanity of it and decide, am I going to hold on to this belief about these individuals, or am I going to let it be informed by what I know personally?
Right.
Yeah, I think Jay is absolutely, from an advocate's perspective, the strongest the tools we have are our personal stories. Jenny Boylan, who is on I Am Kate, said something that has stuck with me in the work that I do. It is really hard to hate someone you know. Right? It's really hard to sit across from the conference room table in a legislative committee hearing. It's really hard to sit across from someone, look them in the face and say, you don't deserve to be treated just like me, right, especially if you know them. So, I mean, from an advocate's perspective, Jay is absolutely right. The more people that come out, the more people that tell their stories, the more public opinion and culture will shift in our direction.
Yeah, right.
And at the same time, if there is someone who's, part of this and listening, participating, or watches the recording, I think it's also real important to know that I have lots of room for someone who's in, I don't want to be prejudiced and name a particular place in the middle of the country, but is somewhere where they're working for an employer who isn't gay friendly. Or transgender friendly, who needs that job to pay for their family or their health care. That I have lots of room for them to make a decision that's safe for them.
Sure.
Right.
So Dave, that kind of makes me want to ask you a question. You guys, One Colorado works all throughout Colorado. Some are smaller towns, not everybody's as open-minded as the folks in Denver. So how do you talk to somebody who's afraid about coming out at work in a smaller town?
I grew up in one of those towns. I grew up in a town here in Colorado with a population of 600. That hasn't changed much since I lived there. I'm pretty out. I think I do media interviews on One Colorado's issue priorities that reach the little town that I'm talking about, and everyone there watches television. And goes to the bar. That's really about all they do in that little town. And so I'm pretty out even now in that little town. And there are times that I feel sometimes unsafe. And I know we hear when civil unions passed just a few years ago, there were people in Grand Junction. We couldn't find a couple to go on television in Grand Junction and do an interview about civil unions. And what it meant to them, and those that did want to said that could we blur their faces out? Yeah. But fast forward to marriage, and we had 2 or 3 couples who were willing to go on television in Grand Junction and tell their story. And so we hear about it all the time. And the only advice that I could give them is to understand what our non-discrimination law currently protects, and sort of the methods for making sure that law gets enforced fairly amongst all of the people who are protected by it. Because there is the Colorado Civil Rights Division, CCRD, is a state-funded agency that is tasked with investigating non-discrimination claims, both in housing, employment, and I also the provision of services. So there are mechanisms in place to protect people, to make sure that they are not being discriminated against. And that's often the advice that we give. People think that they've been discriminated against. We point them in the direction of the Civil Rights Division, whose job it is to investigate those claims.
So this might speak to my ignorance of how government works, but the federal government has anti-discrimination laws. If you live in a state that doesn't have anti-discrimination laws, are there federal agencies that can help protect you in that state?
There are no federal protections at the for LGBT people. And though there is a bill that has been introduced called the Equality Act that would add LGBT categories to the Civil Rights Act, which would essentially protect LGBT people in housing, employment, services, and I think lending is the fourth category. And so that is for a lot of states like Mississippi or Arkansas, where the likelihood of passing a statewide non-discrimination law is pretty low given the conservative leaning of those legislatures. The Equality Act is our best shot at protecting LGBT people, no matter what their zip code is. We are fortunate here in Colorado to have LGBT protections in our non-discrimination law.
Sure, that's great. So I threw everybody a curveball earlier today. There was an article that came out on Bloomberg written by Jeff Green, and I was kind of perplexed by it. On one hand, I thought it was exciting. On the other hand, I see a lot of concerns and risks with it. But it seems to be that more and more companies, in the effort of trying to be diverse and open, are asking their employees about their sexual orientation, asking them to disclose that and document that. I thought it was kind of ironic that two of the companies that were mentioned in the article were both financial services firms, but I guess it's also a Bloomberg article as well. So I wanted to throw that out there and see what your opinions were. I can see risks and rewards to both sides. Jay, do you have any thoughts on that article?
Well, I'm aware of the discussion that's gone on for some time about collecting information about your employees, whether they're LGBT, and asking them to voluntarily do it. Me personally, as an HR leader for many years, I guess my approach to the data that we collected was, I always felt we shouldn't collect any data that we didn't need. Mm-hmm. And that really actually has, for me, that isn't about LGBT issues. That's about a whole host of things. If I need a certain amount of information as an employer to either pay you or comply with the law or run my business efficiently, okay, collect it. Yeah. If I don't, why am I collecting? And I don't know. This is a tough one for me. I hear that they want to be able to frame benefits and use it to actually help them in recruiting. But I have to confess, I am not comfortable with companies collecting information that they don't really have any reason to collect and store.
Interesting. So is there a way to craft those policies without getting that data then? To make a more LGBT or sexually inclusive company?
There have been for years.
Yeah.
There have been for years. I mean, the fact is, most companies, and Schwab was certainly included, had an employee resource group. They had leaders who were out. At one time, they had many more than they had perhaps today, but they had leaders that were out. They could do this. They could do the arithmetic as any of us can do and figure out that if we have a company that has X number of people, we are likely to have this representation of lesbian, gay, transgender, and bisexual people in it. And if we want to be an inclusive employer, what should that look like in terms of our policies and practices? Right. So I don't think it handicaps you to not collect that information. And I think that they mentioned it in here, but I'm particularly sensitive to this, the data security risk that exists, the amount of information that's collected about us and how safe it is. Hey, I don't know who's going to use it for what. Right. If you don't need it to run your business, don't collect it.
Right. They can breach Target or some of these other massive corporations, what makes them believe that they can't get into pretty much anyone's.
Yeah. Go ahead, Dave.
Well, I mean, I agree with Jay. I mean, I think the only benefit that I saw in the entire article was that it was a bragging right for the companies that were collecting. We have this many LGBT employees, which is, I think is great that they're proud of that. But I mean, I think you can get that bragging right without having to collect the data. Right. And you can make your internal policies consistent with fairness and equality for all your employees without collecting that data. The LGBT Community Center here has a great program that they're just rolling out that, for a fee, they'll go into a company and they will train them and teach them and talk about how to make their policies as LGBT friendly as possible. The Human Rights Campaign has their corporate equality index. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, there are already tools in place and trainings in place to get to a company that is LGBT inclusive without data, without that data existing.
Right. Yeah, I think in the last couple of years, just seeing, for example, the commercials from Campbell's Soup, or I think it was Payless Shoes, and then one recently from Mass Mutual. If you're really looking for those bragging rights, connect with your community through the means of connecting with your community. And that's either by advertising to them or supporting the organizations that support that community. And, that's one of the things John and I have done. We've gravitated towards those companies when we are looking for companies to partnership with. We gravitate towards those ones that are already putting themselves out there and saying, we're firmly standing behind you as a company. Sorry, Jay,
Yeah.
you want to say something?
And I think something Dave said earlier is actually far more important than giving me a number that says, in this company of 200,000, I have X number of LGBT employees. And that is, do you have visible leaders who are gay?
Yeah.
Who are lesbian, who are transgender? Do you? Are you supporting the issues that are important to the LGBT community?
Yeah.
Are you present at those kinds of organizations? I got to tell you, that's a whole lot more important to me than you telling me you got X percent.
Right.
That's absolutely right. So there are three big sort of campaigns where the private sector really stepped up. One was around the Boy Scouts ban on gay troops, and sort of the corporates who were funding the Boy Scouts kind of stepping up and saying, we're not going to give you money anymore to discriminate. Like, that's not who we are as a company. We heard from hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people in those companies, some anonymous, some public, saying thank you. Like, it means so much to us to see that our company is stepping up to the plate on this. Marriage equality was another one. One of the amicus briefs in the Windsor decision, I think, had a lot of the big banks and financial companies had written and signed on to an amicus brief. We heard again from all of the employee, openly gay and lesbian and transgender employees of those companies, how grateful they were. And now on these religious exemptions legislation that they're trying to pass in other states, the for-profit companies that have sort of stepped up to say, this isn't who we are, we will not be located in a state where you do this. Again, their employees sort of stepping up and saying, thank you for doing this. I can't tell you how much it means to us to work at a company that's willing to take a stand on issues like this.
Yeah.
I guess that when you think about it, we're talking about the financial decisions of coming out at work. Again, in this whole idea of being prepared, looking for companies that are doing that, or maybe going to your local organizations, LGBT organizations, and asking them, what companies in our area are you getting support from?
Right.
That maybe that's going to be my starting list of employers that I start reaching out to, saying I'm looking for a better job, or I'm looking for a job in this particular town or city. And let's say you're moving from Los Angeles and you're moving to Texarkana because of a job, or because of a family situation. Looking for those kinds of organizations that would be able to provide that kind of information gives you that list of who to look for first.
And
I think that's right. Or go to the Pride Parade and see, what companies have floats and large contingents of people who are marching in those, behind those company banners.
Right.
Yeah, that's true.
And just as a little footnote, one of the things that I loved before I retired from Schwab, we were doing some research on recruiting millennials. And one of the things that became very obvious is if you don't have an LGBT non-discrimination policy in place, it's a problem.
Really?
Yeah.
Not just for LGBT millennials, for all of them.
It's interesting. That's that turning tide. Hey, Dave, do you maybe have a little bit more advice or suggestions that you may give to someone who is looking for how they can find that kind of non-discrimination information from an employer? Maybe you're going to a company that's only has 25 employees. How do you tactfully find that kind of information out? I mean, most of the time when you're going after a company or looking at a company that's got maybe 15,000 employees, it's a little easier to find that because they're going to be up front and forward with that. But what about some of the smaller companies?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you're just going to have to ask in your interview, or can I get a copy of your non-discrimination policy, or is your non-discrimination policy in line with with Colorado's state policy? That's usually when we're talking to places about updating their non-discrimination policy. That's how we frame it, in the context of all you're doing is bringing your internal policy in line with what the state already provides. Mm-hmm. And so I think if that's a tactful way, is your policy in line with what the state of Colorado mandates for non-discrimination protections?
Yeah, I think it's important to remember, no matter where you are, granted there are safe for some exceptions, that when you're going through the interview process, you're interviewing the company as much as they're interviewing you. And of course, there are situations where you just need a job and you want to do whatever you can to get whatever job you can. But I think always keeping that in the back of your mind, that you're also interviewing them. You want to make sure that you find yourself a good home. Right.
You don't know how long you're going to be there. It could be a year. It could be the rest of your life, basically, or working career. So you do want to, like you said, make sure you're interviewing them for the kind of employer you want, not just the kind of employer that's going to pay you.
Right. So I think it was a good discussion. Going to let everybody give us a little close, any kind of takeaways that you have to wrap things up. Jade, any kind of last minute advice or takeaways that you'd like to share?
I don't know that there's anything original. I do believe at my core that that we change the world when we all come out and we're who we are at work and with our families and in our communities of faith and wherever that is. And so, I while I respect the fact that it's difficult for folks, I think there's some really good resources and advice for people. I think Dave has given some very good suggestions for folks, certainly interviewing the company. But at the end of the day, I want people to claim their own power. And so I would really encourage people that if you make that decision that's too risky, push yourself a little bit. Ask yourself, what is it that I'm really risking?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very powerful.
I'll say two things in closing. One, we absolutely cannot lull ourselves into complacency. Yes, things are getting better, but our opposition shows no sign of slowing down. And this religious exemption stuff that they're pushing has the potential to impact everyone at all levels of employment in the United States. So that's one. And two, vote. Elections matter. Elections matter not only for the laws that protect us, but for your pocketbook, for the Supreme Court. I mean, there's so many things that are connecting to voting. Jay talked about claiming your power. That's one of the easiest ways to claim your power and to make sure your voice is heard is to vote. Doesn't matter who you vote for. It really doesn't. But LGBT people showing up to the polls and voting is one way that we continue to show and to exercise the power we have as a community.
Absolutely. Especially at the local level. I mean, we talked about the fact that there's, I think what did you say, Dave, there's only 22 states that have anti-discrimination policies. So we need to be working.
Yeah. And that is only 19 for transgender people.
Right. So at the local level, we really need to keep pushing hard to make sure that those changes happen for individuals, and that really happens at the local level. I mean, we're fortunate in Colorado, like we've said, but voting at the local level in all those other states really is will move the needle and helping many of them feel more comfortable coming out at work.
Yeah, the presidential election gets all the attention, but it's really the grassroots efforts, the small government efforts that really help. And I'll tag on to what Dave was saying. I think the four of us are very fortunate. We have lived, I guess, most of our lives in states or cities that support the LGBT community or have evolved pretty quickly. I think it's probably incumbent upon us to be, I guess, the loudest advocates for our peers who are in the middle of the country, I guess, for lack of a better word.
Right. Or for those who maybe work in industries that it's not generally considered okay to come out. I mean, they still may live in states where there are anti-discrimination laws, but working in industries where it's still not okay. And I think about, oil and gas, especially, it has a stigma around it. So there are certain industries that people may not feel comfortable coming out, and so we do have to support everyone we can.
Yeah.
It's interesting that you bring up oil and gas. We are actually doing some work with some oil and gas companies to highlight the stories of LGBT people who work in the energy industry as a way to soften, I think, internal to the energy industry, how people view LGBT protections. As I said before, it's hard to hate someone you know, right? So when they know that there are people in their sector, in their companies that are LGBT, it makes them stop and think, oh, wow, maybe this issue is an issue that our company should be caring about.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
thank you. Yeah, unfortunately, we've had a couple people join the Blab here at the end, and we are getting ready to wrap up. But we have been talking a lot about the maybe precautions individuals can take and the preparation steps that individuals can take to think about whether or not they want to come out at work. Also, we've seen some potential financial benefits and possibly potential financial pitfalls of coming out at work. But we've provided some of the links and resources for you on the side there on the right-hand rail. So if you want to take a look at some of those resources, and we really appreciate both Dave and Jay sharing their comments with us. It's great to have the stories, and that's one of the reasons why we have Queer Money, is to tell those stories. We'd like, obviously everyone loves a good story, and but it's that carrying of those stories forward and being able to impact change. That's really kind of what our purpose is.
Absolutely. So definitely thank you, Jay, for joining us, and thank you, Dave, as well, for joining us. We also want to thank HIV Smart for their sponsorship. Again, if you have not visited their website, please go visit them at hivsmart.org. So thank you very much for everyone for joining us, and we will have the edited version of the video up on our website at deafreeguys.com Thursday. Yep. And if you would like to, please subscribe to our Queer Money Lifestyle newsletter and stay on top of all the products and services we produce.
Yep.
So thanks, guys, for doing this. I think it's awesome.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Dave, for the great work that you do.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We'll be in touch.